actually staffed with people who come from the different departments, foreign affairs, internal security, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we're looking at is these two different logics. Two logics that are in a way changing the way we think about borders. One has to do with the territorial logic. You know, the territorial logic is something that history was established maybe, you know, with Westphalia. It's 400 years old, and it's the way we think. We even dream about borders today, all of us. It's part of our culture. We don't question it very much. The other one is the virtual, the invisible bordering processes that are being implemented worldwide, and that we don't understand so well. The way the research program basically really addresses this is looking at 6 different themes that you have here. We look at governance, we look at movements and flows, and this is a really important one. We look also at history and culture of bordering, how, for instance, moving population, the movement of population is a real issue, like the Uyghur in northern China, you know, that had just gone through DNA testing for the whole region because China really wants to control this population. We look at security and sustainability. So I'm summarizing some of this, but what I want to say here is that we are basically discussing 45 studies, and I'm going to organize my talk along those different themes. Question the end of the territory. So the first way, and the way most of us have been trained to understand borders, is to look at borders as a manifestation of sovereignty and state having international agreements, that they are not going to interfere with each other's sovereignty, and that even though they may have been foes, now they are friends. And they can negotiate international treaties and go through, you know, peace process or arbitration, but there are mechanisms so that they establish their boundary lines. And the big challenge to this is the connectivity challenge. I think I'm going to, oh, it's back. So the connectivity challenge is a real issue today because it's hard for all of us to actually comprehend what it means in terms of governance and in terms of the policies that government, but also private sector organizations have to go to undertake, to implement so that bordering actually works. And this is kind of what I want to discuss with you today. So the first thing that I want to discuss is the end of territory. One of the most important papers called The Territorial Trap, 1994, by John and Hughes, talks about the fact that borders are social and political containers, basically. Right? They delineate territories, and they also delineate political communities. And one of the things that we're asking today is, we understand this from the perspective, from the historical perspective of the Constitution of States. States, there is 15 studies on this. So one of the things that we observe in our studies is that states right now, as public entities, international negotiators and protectors of their own boundaries, they have 2 major issues. One is the decentralization of power. And I'm not talking, you know, just about fairly territorially small states like the Netherlands, Israel, but I'm talking about largely populated ones like India or China. China has lots of issues with this. And they are faced with movement of self-determination. A lot of understanding of this movement of self-determination, for instance, in Africa, in Latin America, have to do and are understood primarily as First Nations, indigenous populations, have wanting political power and challenging the state It's an old idea. It's something that was discussed already by Woodrow Wilson in 1919, 1918, before the Treaty of Paris was signed. And it's in a way something that we still perceive as the tail end of decolonization. But that's not all of it. That's not all the story. It's a major issue in our country, in Canada, where most of the northern territories, the Yukon, all of these regions are today challenged by First Nations. The Yukon, for instance, today controls 70% of the land of the Yukon territory, so you have a sense of the space. The Yukon is almost 4 times as large as France, 4 times, almost 5 times as large as Spain, right? And they control it, and the natural resources in these areas are very large. And we're talking about maybe 28,000 people who are First Nations in the Yukon. So this idea is that basically larger federated states like Canada are fragmenting to a certain extent. There is what Saskia Sassen talks about when she says that there is a fragmentation of the legal structures. You devolve power to local, equal types governments. You have what we call in Canada government to government to government agreement. Within the state, the power is weakened from a legal perspective. And then you also have the fact that you have more and more international agreement. And here it's quite interesting to look at Canada as well. So in the 1960s, Canada had about 5,000–6,000 international agreements. Today we're talking about 160,000. You look at the European Union, and you look at international agreements that the European Union has signed just in the last maybe 20 years to organize neighborhood policies, to organize security in its periphery, from almost nothing to about 2,500 international agreements to regulate all kinds of different things. This is not talking about, the old boundary line that basically globally organizes all of the legal activity of one state, or even just the European Union, or just the Canadian federal state. It's a complex set of agreements that are going way beyond the traditional territorial boundary of Canada or the EU. These agreements go in many different directions within the territory and outside of the boundaries. So we're talking about these kinds of transformations. Now, this is made more complex by the connectivity challenge. And so one of the issues that we are dealing with here is looking at regulatory regimes. These are regimes that organize very specific industries. The electricity industry, the oil industry in North America, for instance, the gas industry, and things as, nobody would look at it, but we do. Things like food processing, farm products, like, even things like cheese and milk. And we try to see how these sectors sometimes self-regulate, sometimes have agreements so that they have the exact same regulation across a continent. And we find great diversity here. So for instance, in North America, the electricity sector has only one regulator, completely federated, and imposes the same standards across the whole of North America, from the Arctic boundary all the way to the Mexican border. You have one regulator. If you make electricity on a farm, you depend on that regulator wherever you are. You can be in the Yukon, or you can be, on the Mexican border. But if you're in the oil industry, it varies with counties and municipalities. That's why pipelines are always a headache and very difficult to put in place. And the same for the food industry. If you look at the food processing industry, it's much more like a puzzle with, you have a 1,000-piece puzzle and you take 200 pieces off of the puzzle and you've lost them. So it's almost completely homogeneous, but within that puzzle, you're missing pieces where the regulatory standards are gone. where the regulatory standards are completely different again. So when we think about security, one of the things that we have here is also looking at how these regulatory standards, in a way, would transfer into security networks. And we look here. I think the microphone is gone again. Can you hear me? No, okay, thank you. So what we're looking here is basically how these flows, this movement, and the regulatory standards that superimpose them impact the way we understand security. Hence, looking at security networks, but of very varied geographies. Networks that are small, networks that are global. Not networks that are contained within international boundaries. Certainly, they go way beyond. So big ask question whether regulatory system governing movements of products, services, and people straddle boundary lines. And obviously you understood it. We do find in many different instances that the boundary line is completely irrelevant, at least in North America. When we look at the EU, you look at the number of international agreements the EU has, and you can ask the same question, and you have some serious data to show you that the boundary line is also becoming more and more irrelevant. And we undertook 15 studies in this area. So what we find is that the idea of, territory and connectivity here is quite actually an interesting one, and it's a real challenge to understand it because borders as territorial containers, in a way, are withering away. It's a good idea to have well-defined international boundaries. This is why, for instance, China is so harsh with its 14 dyads and renegotiating the exact position, GPS-like, for instance, with India and some of the other neighbors, right? Where you have ice melting, and you have people patrolling those borders wherever the flow of water is going, and they disappear on a regular basis because the land is just so unwelcoming in these areas. And it's also why China is so hard at sea, negotiating and trying to establish the boundary lines as well as possible. But the idea here is that the castle wall mentality is basically becoming much more complex than we ever thought about it before, because it's faced with variable geometry. It's faced with even variable geographies for geographers in the room. But the idea of variable geometry is actually really important here. We're dealing with bounding movements. And how do we do this? Probably all of you in the room have some ideas here. So, in the area of security, I have here a nice picture. It's one of my favorite ones. It's the picture of the signature of Westphalia. But we also have biometry. We also have the Hadrian Wall, which is the picture I took. I really like this picture of the Hadrian Wall because it's the oldest wall in the Western world, one of the oldest walls in the Western world. We are actually in the area of biometry today. So in the area of security, we basically ask, what are, in a way, the new invention around this territorial bordering? How do we transfer our ideas? For the last 100 years, we've been trained as geographers to understand that territory and boundaries were everything. Gideon published a really important work in the 1980s on this, and I kind of picked up on his work and tried to do something a few years ago, looking at territorial boundary, territorial, positional, and functional bordering processes. And now I discover through the 15 studies I'm going to discuss with you very briefly that the whole idea that territorial borders are not going to disappear, far from that. They are still here to stay. But bordering is becoming much more complex. Because what we're trying today is to actually border movement far out, not at the boundary line. The idea of gate and specializing points of entry, obviously we've been doing this for almost 2,000 years. We know how to do this. Well, truck here, people there, bicycle here, oil, gas, electricity, one way, and then people, other trucks with, certain goods in different gates. We know how to do this. We do this fairly well. But how do we prevent in that huge flow You know, as Alan Bursin, the former deputy at Department of Homeland Security said, find the pin lost in the haystack. How do we actually do this at the source of movement? So that at the boundary line, it's actually already pre-cleared. We don't have to worry about it. Or we already know it's not going to actually enter the flow. And that's what we're looking at here. So I'm going to pass on this slide for time. What we see here is that progressively more and more state policies are pushing the boundary out. We see this in the regulatory system. In the food industry, we find that meat being packaged in Canada for specific markets in Asia, like Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, cross the border in the production plant in the middle of Saskatchewan or Manitoba. They are already in Japan by the time they're loaded in the containers and sent all the way across. They would not be able to go anywhere else in the world but that destination. So the regulatory processes organize crossing boundary line or regulatory system at source. The origin of movement is everything. Policymakers in Canada told me, so we do this at source and at destination. But really, when we talk about pre-clearance, for instance, which is now being generalized between Canada and the US, we are organizing the crossing of the boundary line far out. Canada has 55 agreements today to pre-clear goods and people. What does this mean? It means that you cross the border in the custom warehouses when it's not done in the production plant. It means that you cross the border when you're certified, for instance, to get something like a Nexus card or the enhanced driver's license. You're part of the database. You are in the database. You're a pre-approved traveler. So we don't govern ourselves the same way. We don't think territorially. We think functionally. That's a really important difference. We think that each and every function of movement can have a different process to cross the boundary line. It's not a boundary line anymore, but cross the border. So we implement trust mechanisms and we organize mechanisms that continually, in a way, organize information. So my rating to cross the Canada-US border gives me a number or an algorithm which basically tells the agent how secure I am. And every time I'm checked by luck, you know, if you pick up the wrong number, because obviously we can't check everybody, my algorithm will give me a better score or a worse score. And with computers, we can basically individualize this, both for goods moving, containers moving, providers like, you know, trucking companies, transportation organizations, but also people who are producing goods. And so we can individualize, functionally organize all of this. Alan Bursin and I agree on this. We agree that the new boundaries, the new borders, the borders of functions are basically being implemented today. What are the challenges, therefore, that we have here? How do we see states adapt here? Now, I'm almost at the end of my time, so I'm going to summarize this. What we see is we see more and more partnership. We see a regulatory system that basically merge together security and regulatory standards. And what we see really completely transforming the border and the border security, but also the border studies field, is that very progressively states create border crossing at the source of movement. And the governance of border crossing at the source of movements means that state organizations like in the case of France, I have a good example at the Roissy terminal. If you go to Roissy in Paris at the airport, now you have tribunals that are dealing with immigration issues, right? Now, in the past, they were always located in the sub-prefecture. In the case of Paris, it would have been at the core of the city. Today, it's in the hub, because that's where the movements are. It has nothing to do, it's also a completely different function of the state. And at the same time, you have, one of these, what do you call them, treatment center, where people are sent to if they don't have status. If you're in the database, if you've been pre-cleared, you'll never know about these things. If you're not in the database, if you're not being pre-cleared and your papers are not exactly right, it's likely that you're going to spend some time in those centers. And it's the same for goods. So the big findings of borders in globalization is that these borders appear in regulatory system and production chains. They also, but also in security procedures. We basically bring them together and we work together to implement them at source of movement. Now, to conclude on this, I just want to say this. The most powerful states can sign and impose these agreements worldwide. There are states who are only recipient of such agreements. They can't impose them to anybody. They won't have the resources, they don't have the human resources, the financial resources, the technological resources to do so. And I think this is kind of the next leg in that research. We have to understand what states or what organizations like the European Union are able to do in this regard. The European Union is a very, very active organization in this regard. It's pushing pre-clearance all out. It's creating and testing new forms of visas. These visas have more legwork, if you want, or power than passports. They even basically rewrite the algorithm that they use to filter people and goods and organize these agreements worldwide. So this is kind of the next step. Understanding territorial boundaries, in a way, is our history. But understanding the future is going where we're going, which is to understand how we border movements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. I'll let James go.
שאלות אפשר יהיה לשאול בסוף, אחרי... אוקיי.